Welcome to Comic Book Historians. Today we're talking about Chester Gould's Dick Tracy. Now, Chester Gould originally created Dick Tracy as Plainclothes Tracy in 1931. Originally, Plainclothes Tracy was changed to Dick Tracy by Chester Gould's boss, Captain Patterson, who thought that that name would sell more. He proved to be right because Dick Tracy was a big smash and really captured a lot of the gritty, Elliot Ness, Al Capone crime storylines of the 1930s. Now, Dick Tracy was certainly a law and order type character, to the extent in which he would even get on the phone and investigate federal crimes with the head of the comic strip's quote-unquote Washington Bureau, who was depicted by Chester Gould as none other than J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI in the 1930s. Now, as the comic strip begins, you can see that Chester Gould does not hold back in depicting the brutality of the mob scene. You see here that you have mobsters torturing an informant, and God only knows what's going on in the background. Now, scenes like this would prepare the reader for even more gritty and inhumane portrayals of criminal behavior. For example, look at this scene with human trafficking. Now, interesting is the contrast of Chester Gould's cartooning with the grim scenery that we see before us as far as human slaves stuffed into the hold of a ship, where we can see that there is insane amounts of body odor, inhumanity, and cruelty. Now, this depravity of criminals continues with references to the criminals of the day. Like, look at this here with John Dillinger in 1934, who actually charmed the police officers and actually took a photo with them shortly before he used a fake wooden gun to escape his way out of jail. Chester Gould depicted a character like this named Arson, who used a potato carved into the shape of a gun, darkened with iodine, and used that to escape from jail, and was also able to take a picture shortly before the escape depicting how he had charmed the cops. Look at these pictures next to each other. This is Chester Gould summoning the criminals of the day. Now, the criminals start to get more inhumane and sadistic, and as they get more extraordinarily outlandish, you see certain criminal archetypes start to rear their ugly heads. The bald mad scientist like Lex Luthor that would show up in Superman. Well, Dick Tracy had a character like that first, like this professor who actually captured the rabies virus and talked about how he would use it on innocent dogs and innocent humans in order to torment and crush and dominate their souls. Dick Tracy and company are shocked when they come up to the criminal's window and see that he is cackling even further with laughter as he chokes a dog, injects it with rabies, and then sicks it on an innocent prisoner in order to murder him. What a sicko! Don't worry though, this germ warfare bald-headed bacteriologist gets his just desserts as the rabies-infected dog chews out his throat as it bleeds all over the floor in front of a helpless Dick Tracy, trapped in his net, and he can't do anything about it. Woe the humanity. But don't worry, the fun doesn't stop there. Remember in 1932 we had the character Broadway Bates, who looked a lot like Batman's Penguin character. Well, in 1936, we explore the supervillain with costumes. And here we have the Purple Cross Gang from 1936 comic strips of Dick Tracy. And these masked criminals were so ruthless, so sadistic, they didn't just rob banks, but they mercilessly murdered helpless, innocent civilians. Now, finally, Chester Gould went all in on the costume criminal with The Blank in 1937. The Blank was a character much like Rorschach and The Question, who actually went after other criminals and was mercilessly stalking and murdering them. Now, honestly, The Blank was more like Rorschach in that he had no mercy on other criminals. His brutality is pretty amazing to look at because he would actually throw criminals out of moving cars so they could break their necks, throw them out of moving planes so they could die instantly but have a lot of fear before their death, and even tie them under cars while the car was on so they could die from carbon monoxide poisoning. He mystified detectives who were hot on his trail by using smoke to disappear, much like Batman. But of course he was more like the Punisher in that he would murder anybody who got in his way. He was eventually found and discovered by Dick Tracy, who used forensic methods to track him down and unmask him. In fact, his mission was to find and kill criminals because they had rejected him for being too ugly because he got his face shot off years earlier, and he wanted revenge for this rejection. His name really was Frank Redrum. Redrum, backward for murder. So how does Chester Gould find these criminals? Well, he uses a variety of mechanisms. In 1935, Chester Gould uses the lie detector in a Dick Tracy storyline in order to reveal further information on a criminal investigation. Even as early as 1932, Dick Tracy would use forensics and ballistics to discover the point in which the trajectory of the bullet came from, what type of bullet, how fast it was when it hit, usually based on how dented the bullet was, and use that to discover the type of gun that was fired at him and who likely shot him. This is an example of how Dick Tracy was the world's greatest detective before Batman came by 6 years after this. Although there was a proliferation of criminals in the Dick Tracy comic strip, make no mistake, Dick Tracy and the police had no mercy for the criminals that they sought and went after. There was no sign of sending the criminals to an ineffective asylum only for them to be released months later to kill again. No, Dick Tracy would either arrest outright or kill and execute. Oftentimes, the battle between Dick Tracy's police force and organized crime was explosive, gruesome, and merciless. You can see cars exploding. You could see people getting shot against walls. There was no mercy on the streets of Chicago at this time. Chester Gould really meant to show 1930s newspaper strip readers that crime did not pay and only ruthless justice would await them. Why, look at this punch in the nose that Dick Tracy would deliver to this real scumbag. You could see his nose pop and bleed as he's completely caught off guard by Dick Tracy's square jaw and iron fist, delivering nothing but justice and revenge. Oftentimes, the criminals were so heinous, so horrible, that by the time Dick Tracy delivered the shot in between the eyes, the criminal outright deserved it. Now, in the mid-1930s, Chester Gould was siphoning the real-life stories of John Dillinger, the Ma Barker gang, Al Capone's gang, and he would put together characters that ended up deserving their fate. And if Dick Tracy didn't kill him, usually some sort of natural disaster or some sort of karma play would happen. Like, for example, this figure was so terrible that a bear ended up eating him in the woods. There was no escape from the sort of justice that Chester Gould would deliver. Look at this other character who was actually tied up inside of a wall, only left to starve, die, and decompose into nothing but bones. Considering that Chester Gould created Dick Tracy for the Chicago Tribune Newspaper Syndicate, there's very little doubt that the Chicago mobs influenced the content of his storylines. He would actually create a large crime saga in comic book form that utilized forensics and ballistics, as well as revenge, raw human emotion, to show in a much larger perspective that crime does not pay.